Hello guys, welcome to the fiction series. Today we are gonna see, what if Naruto got harem with Katara, Toph and Azula? Part 1. Huge shout out to UNINSPIREDUSERNAME101 for this story. If you want more awesome fan fiction like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. So without wasting any time, let's get into the video. The landscape of a once beautiful forest was now riddled with the scars of a vicious confrontation years in the making. Two young souls inhabited the scorched earth, standing opposite to one another, both facing forward and away. Their positions perfectly symbolized where they stood in relation to one another in their views and where they were in life, one stemming from nothing with just as much expected, both with childhood so abruptly taken from them as a result of the ambitions of others. With as many similarities as they shared, so too were their differences vast. The most prominent of which being their morals and ideals. Somewhere along the way their paths diverged, only to once more converge, this time in opposition. It didn't have to be this way, but you just wouldn't listen, Naruto expressed sorrowfully as he studied the damage inflicted to his trembling, bleeding hand. It was numb despite how he clenched it. His face twisted with mounting anguish and indignation, he released these feelings in a bellow. Why couldn't you just fucking listen? You might not think so, Naruto, but it was always going to end this way, Sasuke retorted with a bloody but genuine smile. With one of us finally killing the other. Naruto's head fell, his hair weighed down with blood and sweat, obscuring the despondency in his eyes. It was then he realized that which everyone tried to tell him, that which he always tried so desperately to disprove and deny. Sasuke's loyalties lied only with himself, and his ambition for vengeance had consumed him. He was lost. Sasuke's path to redemption led only one way now, and Naruto had just led him to the end of it. Sasuke fell to a knee, clutching the center of his chest with his remaining hand in a vein as the remnants of his heart further drained him of life with every beat. Despite this, his smile turned into a smirk, eyes shut. You know, Naruto, I didn't think you'd ever actually do it. I was counting on it, actually. I always gave you a choice, and so many chances, but you just couldn't do the same for me. Tears escaped his own clenched eyes. I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. I couldn't let you hurt them. Sasuke snorted at this, eliciting a series of sickly wet coughs. I'd say you finally learned your lesson, but you still haven't, Naruto. You're still the same fool you always were. What are you? Naruto turned, sensing Sasuke's chakra spike just in time to find him glaring with bleeding heterochromatic eyes. Before he could react, flames devoid of light consumed his vision. Sasuke. Naruto could feel the all-consuming flames begin to sear his chest first, the pain immediate and deep-reaching, a feeling unlike any he'd ever experienced before. Planetary devastation. Kurama attempted to warn him of another incoming attack, but in his sheer panic, he didn't hear him, and it was far too late when he realized what was happening as reality itself began to warp around the sheer force of the ever-mounting gravity that threatened to consume him. All at once the might of Kurama's chakra exploded out of him. The increase in power saved him from being crushed and healed his body just as quickly as it was consumed by the flames, extending the excruciating pain of Sasuke's final act of betrayal and cowardice. For the first time in a long time, Naruto felt Kurama vying for control of his actions, another betrayal in itself. This finished breaking what remained of his spirit, and overwhelmed by everything all at once, he relinquished himself as the world around him distorted before the darkness finally consumed him. Katara lay in her sleeping role, staring aimlessly up to the section of the night sky visible through the opening at the top of the tent she shared with her brother, illuminated vaguely by the waning fire between them. He was snoring, but not as loudly as he sometimes did, so she couldn't exactly blame him for her current restlessness, as sleep continued to evade her. No, like many nights before, it was her own thoughts keeping her awake, just as restless. Katara could never admit just how discontent she was with her life, not when her father and the brave men of their tribe were so far away, fighting against the impossible. But it had been nearly 2 years since their departure, and though her anxiety surrounding his safety remained a constant, she'd learned to live with it. She had no choice but to. Yet, despite her best efforts to remain optimistic, there were times in which she'd become resigned to the very real possibility she'd never see her father again. After all, 2 years was a very long time with no correspondence, but they'd been made aware of this necessity before their departure, lest they lead the Fire Nation back to their lands. In the end, all Katara could do was hope for the best, but so too did she know to expect the absolute worst should it come to be. As was the reality of their world. And despite her brief lapses into demoralizing anxiety, she tried her absolute best to remain hopeful of the day when she would see her father again. As she awaited his return, all she could do was what was best for their tribe. This, unfortunately, amounted to little more than menial chores, such as fishing with her brother, Sokka, as well as helping rear the children of their tribe. all rewarding in its own right, but undoubtedly mind-numbing after so much time, especially considering the fact she was the Southern Water Tribe's last waterbender. That distinction, however, meant very little when there was no one to help her master her abilities. Her grandmother, Kanna, had taught her as much as she could, considering she herself was not a bender. Relying solely on what she'd gleaned from her time before the waterbenders of their tribe were eradicated. This amounted to little more than meditation techniques, which at the very least, allowed her to move water, proving she possessed the ability, but little else. Her progress had all but stagnated since the age of 10, and they weren't exactly in any position to journey for a proper master. With that, her learning had been put on indefinite hold in order to care for the tribe as a whole. It was a responsibility Katara didn't take lightly, but it wasn't one she was extraordinarily excited to be relegated to. Not like Sokka, who wore his responsibility as the sole protector of the tribe like a badge of honor. That's not to say she thought any less of him for it. The opposite was true, in fact. She was incredibly proud of just how serious her otherwise aloof brother took this responsibility, even if she didn't exactly ever show it. After all, he already boasted an overinflated sense of ego she wasn't exactly fond of, and she wasn't about to contribute in making it any larger. Katara, meanwhile, would continue to do as was expected of her with a smile she allowed to fall away only when she was alone. Though only 14, she was reluctantly growing accustomed to the fact all she would ever be was just another girl of the Southern Water Tribe, likely to be wed off to whatever man could offer their tribe the most, be it from within or out. They were in no position to be selective. Katara wrapped a scarf around herself as it was colder than usual and decided to take a late-night walk in an effort to clear her mind of such dark thoughts, as she often did. She was careful to tread quietly through the crunching snow, ascending the steps leading up to the wall of ice and snow to the walkway carved out within it. She could stray no further than this as the walls were the only thing protecting them from the predators that tended to stay away, but lurked around nevertheless. She waved at the woman keeping watch in one of the corners, who simply waved back. Her name was Sana, and though a woman of 24 years in age, her sole responsibility was providing overwatch at night. Should the worst come to be, all she could do was alert her brother of any danger. Katara never agreed with her tribe's customs regarding the responsibility of the women as being little more than wives and homemakers, but neither could she argue against it. Especially with just how close to the brink of non-existence as they were. Can't sleep? Sana's question was more of a statement. Sokka's snoring again, she offered the usual excuse with a sheepish shrug of her shoulders. Doesn't he always? She chuckled. But don't worry, I get it. I'll leave you to it. Thanks, Katara smiled at the woman, suspecting she knew all too well her brother wasn't the reason behind her restlessness. The constellations were bright that cloudless night, but her focus was, as always, on the full moon. She wondered then, as she just as often did, if her father was doing the same. While a childish notion, she also hoped something, anything, would happen to save her from what had become of her life in perpetuity. Like that'll ever happen, she whispered to herself, her breath visible briefly before it disappeared into the night in spindly wisps. Katara was well aware the most likely change would come in the form of giant Fire Nation warships landing on their shores. The wish for change was to wish for this, and that was downright selfish. But that didn't stop her from dreaming of a world free of the ever-looming threat of the Fire Nation. A world in which all four nations lived in harmony once more. A world in which her mother never died. Katara continued to observe the moon for a time longer, lost within her own thoughts, until her eyes began growing heavy and her yawns grew closer together in frequency. She was just about to call it a night, but something caught her attention. It was a void in the sky that presented itself as a suspicious absence of stars in the night. This was not altogether rare, much less concerning, if not for the fact she was certain the void was present in the same location, a constellation loosely resembling a fish typically resided. Upon closer inspection, it appeared to be a dark mass in the very sky, but it was no cloud. Defying all rationale, it seemed to be perfectly spherical, seemingly absorbing all light around and behind it. It also appeared to be expanding. Do you see that? Katara asked aloud while also blinking long and hard, briefly considering what she was seeing may have been the beginnings of sleep deprivation. But she wasn't that tired, and the object undoubtedly remained. See what? Sana joined her and looked in the direction she was pointing. What is that? So you see it too? Katara didn't take her eyes off the object. I do, nervousness began to seep into her words. But what is it? I don't know. Abruptly it began to shrink, but not before emitting a short but very bright flash, powerful enough to momentarily bring day to night. Katara heard Sana gasp at her side, but she was briefly blinded and left disoriented. When her vision returned, so too had the night sky, the same as it always was, constellations and all, with the exception of a figure. It was the clear outline of a person and they were falling quickly. Katara traced the figure as it descended in a stunned silence until it impacted a short distance away with a resounding crash that cemented what she was seeing to be very much real. That was definitely a person. Stay here while I warn the others. Sana instructed as she began descending the wall, all while blowing on the tiger seal tusk multiple times over, their tribe's distress call. Katara, however, had not taken heed to this. Acting before she could fully consider the implications of what exactly she had witnessed or what she herself was doing, slid down the incline of the wall to begin running in the direction of the crash. She didn't have to go too far beyond the walls before finding herself upon a strange sight indeed. It was a man. A young man, likely around Sokka's age, give or take, unmoving, except for the weak rising and falling of his chest. The action itself was accompanied by a horrifying rasping sound she soon realized was his breathing. He was alive. Heedless and unaware of the few already gathering behind her, Katara ran the remaining distance to him, determined to help. That was until a familiar voice stopped her just beyond arm's reach. "Katara, wait." Sokka called out to her. He was running towards her in a full sprint despite the thick snow beneath, dressed in his sleeping furs, wielding his favorite dual-bladed boomerang in one hand and a wavering torch in the other. "Who's that? And what do you think you're doing?" "He needs our help." Katara dropped into the snow at the young man's side, the lighter brother provided illuminating his features. His chest was bare and horribly marred, with the most prominent of which being the sizable scar near his heart. This drew her attention first, but then it was his brightly colored hair, stained with blood, yet still a similar shade of the setting sun above an angular face inflicted with even more scarring. 3 lines spanned across his cheeks, almost purposely so given their symmetry. What remained of his clothing was little more than orange tatters over what looked to be mesh armor of sorts, melted and distorted around his shoulders, a singed pair of pants matching in color, and a silver plate tied around his forehead, displaying a symbol she couldn't recognize. This, along with his fair skin and the glaring fact he'd fallen from the sky, clearly alluded to the certitude that the young man was not of their lands. Who the hell is he and where did he come from? Sana was spouting some nonsense about him falling from the sky. Sokka was at her side, his boomerang held tightly in his hand, positioned and poised to strike should he need to. "I don't know, and he did fall from the sky," Katara said, taking notice then of how the snow surrounding the young man began to melt, hissing and releasing steam. In fact, his entire body was emanating steam. "He did what now?" Sokka sounded absolutely incredulous. "Hey wait, don't touch him, Katara." She pulled her hand back at once, but not because her brother told her to. "He's hot." "Katara, is this really the time to be fawning over boys?" Sokka muttered. "No, you idiot." Despite the situation at hand, her cheeks immediately warmed in the idle acknowledgement he was indeed handsome. His face, twisted in a grimace, was pleasantly masculine, his shoulders broad, and his exposed muscles defined and pronounced. But that couldn't be the furthest from what she was referring to. "I mean he's literally hot to the touch, as in he's burning. Look, he's melting the snow around him." "So he's a firebender?" Sokka whispered, eyes wide. "Sokka, wait." The sharp end of his boomerang came within inches of her face. She'd thrown herself over the young man just in time to save him from being struck. "What are you doing, Katara? Get out of the way." Sokka pulled his boomerang back, bouncing it on his shoulder impatiently. "You said it yourself, he's a freaking firebender. Why are you protecting him?" "That's not what I said." Katara barked. "That's just the conclusion you came to. Right now all we know is that he needs our help." "We don't even know who this guy is," Sokka shouted back. "Putting aside the fact he apparently fell from the sky and now he's literally steaming, we don't know he's not a firebender or what his intentions are." "Their brother is right." Gran. Katara looked to find her grandmother, along with a majority of the tribe, the older women, and the boys Sokka had been training to be the next generation of warriors, had since gathered. Some of them wielded torches, others spears, along with other makeshift weaponry such as pans and filleting knives. They all appeared incredibly nervous at the arrival of the stranger, and her brother's words weren't making the situation any better. "His body heat alone continues to melt the snow around him," Kanna said as she stepped forward and free of the amassed crowd of frightened women and children. "It would make sense to end his life now before he can do the same to us." "Exactly. Now get out of the way, Katara," Sokka ordered. Katara remained steadfast, arms spread out to protect him from their prejudice. "But Gran, that isn't right." She could feel her eyes beginning to burn, unbelieving of the cruelty that was stemming from her grandmother of all people. "He's hurt and he needs our help. We can't just kill him." "Have you stopped to consider why he's in his current condition?" Kanna questioned somberly. "We know nothing of this boy, but all signs suggest he's a firebender and that he's just endured combat. I am sorry, Katara, but we simply cannot risk the safety of our people for one boy." "But..." Sokka tossed his torch aside and advanced on her. "Get out of the way already." He grabbed her by the shoulder and roughly shoved her out of his way, bringing his boomerang down on the stranger's head. Or so he intended. Katara, who'd shut her eyes out of instinct, opened them hearing the collective gasp from behind. The young man's hand gripped the weapon, stopping it mere inches from impacting just above his heart. The metal groaned as it melted around his now bleeding hand. What the heck? Sokka fell on his butt and began to backpedal with all the grace of an inebriated crustacean. The young man sat up abruptly, tossing the boomerang aside, his eyes were frantic as he looked around him, his breathing fast in a clear display of panic. The remnants of the Southern Water Tribe watched on with bated breath as the boy's vibrant blue eyes roamed them all. Their fear palpable as a tribe consisting of one young man, women, children, and the elderly, they were all very much aware there wasn't much they could do to defend themselves against a firebender. He began to vocalize, speaking hoarsely in a language none could understand or even recognize. "Katara, get away from him." Sokka shouted at her and again, she didn't listen. Katara slowly approached him, receiving his undivided attention at once. He didn't display any outward signs of aggression as she neared him, only confusion. When she was within arm's reach, he held out his bleeding hand in her direction, halting her. "It's okay," she offered kindly and with a smile. She slowly undid her scarf and kneeled at his side. Working carefully, she wrapped it around his injured hand, observing his confusion as she tied it. He didn't so much as flinch as she anticipated when she tightened the scarf to secure it. After she finished, she placed her hands on her knees and smiled at him. He stared back at her for a time before returning the gesture slightly, uttering a single word she chose to interpret as his appreciation. "See everyone?" Katara turned to her frightened tribe with a smile. "He's friendly." "It could be a trick," Sokka warned, still laid out in the snow, he was glaring daggers at the stranger. "He's outnumbered right now and is probably just biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to attack." "Surrounded by who?" "Women and children," Katara countered. Despite the situation, Sokka seemed offended by this. "Hey, and just what am I? And hey, he broke my boomerang." "Because you tried to hit him with it," Katara snapped. "And you see, he didn't try fighting back. I think that more than proves I'm right." Katara, Kanna spoke slowly and equally as carefully. "This proves nothing. Back away from him, now." "But Gran, I." "Now, Katara," Kanna shouted. She never shouted at her. Katara looked back to the young man, who returned her attention intently, offering him a sorrowful smile before doing as she was told. All the while he watched her go with what almost resembled understanding in his pained eyes. Once amongst the crowd, Katara watched him rise on uneven feet, grimacing in pain, the sole action seemed to have cost him much of his strength. This sorrowful display, of course, elicited even more panic from the tribe. Sokka had since acquired a spear from one of the boys and took his own position before them all. Katara was grateful he didn't try and attack again, taking instead to waiting for the stranger to make the first move, be it out of fear or something else entirely, was difficult for her to discern. To her surprise, the young man bit into his own thumb, deep enough to draw blood before moving his hands in a series of odd but undoubtedly purposeful configurations conducted so fast his hands were almost a blur. He concluded his display by slamming his right hand into the ground. Her tribe, including Katara herself, flinched and waited with nervous anticipation for something to happen. The same could be said for the young man. He lifted his head, as if expecting something, but found nothing but a settling plume of powdered snow and a people on a blade's edge before him. He frowned, in parts out of confusion as well as frustration, uttering a single word that must have been a curse to match his expression. Once more he moved his hands in the same series of configurations, much slower this time, allowing Katara to see how he moved his fingers in odd ways, before slamming his hand down once more to the same result. He tried 3 more times with increasing frustration each time, cratering the very ground beneath him with such force upon his final attempt, Katara could feel the ground tremble beneath her own feet. When the curtain of snow finally cleared, it revealed a young man who seemed to have come to a realization only he was privy to. Whatever the realization, it must have been a truly horrifying one, as his frustration gave way to despair. His head fell, obscuring his face for all but a moment before he released these feelings in a roar so powerful it sent visible waves rippling along the snow, echoing for a time even after he ran out of breath. He proceeded to fall to his knees and then face first into the snow, unmoving. What just happened?" Sokka was the first to speak. "What was he doing?" "I don't know, but what I do know is that he didn't try and attack us." Katara reiterated this to her grandmother. "See? He had plenty of chances to do something, but he didn't." "Oh, he tried to do something, we just don't know what," Sokka argued. "He's in a weakened state," Kanna observed the boy closely. Whatever that display may have been, his very hands cratered the earth beneath him. "It wasn't bending, but this and what he did to your brother's boomerang with his bare hand proves he's undoubtedly powerful. We absolutely cannot allow him to remain near our tribe." Exactly. Sokka agreed. Then what do you suggest we do now? Katara shouted with tears of frustration now pooling in her eyes. Are we supposed to kill him? Attack him as he lays there in the snow, defenseless and hurt? Just ruthlessly take his life? And do you suggest we allow this man to grow to full strength so that he may pillage our tribe, taking what he wants, who he wants, how he wants it? Kanna countered calmly but pointedly. The implications of her words were absolutely horrifying, especially for the women who flinched hearing this, some unfortunately, from experience. We don't know he'd do that. Katara tried to argue, but with much less conviction at being presented with such a horrible scenario. But you don't know for certain he wouldn't, do you, Katara? Kanna rebutted. Are you so willing to stake the safety of our tribe for the life of one man? But Katara didn't have a response to that. What was worse yet, she was beginning to see reason in her grandmother's words, but neither could she find it in her heart to do what they were suggesting. While she wasn't likely to be the one to carry out such a gruesome task that would most likely befall her brother, inaction on her end was the same as being the one to take his life in her mind. No matter the risk, Katara simply couldn't settle that with herself. What if I take him far away from here? Katara suggested, unsure of herself even as she spoke. That way it'd only be me. Anna seemed taken aback hearing this. What are you even saying right now? Sokka, meanwhile, was livid. Did you not just hear what Gran said? You're a girl. Do you know what he could do to you? What he'll do to the rest of us when he's done using you? You can't exactly get him far enough away from the tribe he couldn't find us. Katara hugged herself, shivering once more at the vile implications. Your brother is right, Kanna said. See? Gran, we can't just. But so too are you, Katara. Kanna's words caused a wave of uncertainty across those gathered. If we were to take this young man's life, and he proved to be an innocent soul, would we be any better than the Fire Nation? Indiscriminately destroying that which we fear. Gran, you can't be serious right now. Sokka ran to her. We should just. Kill him. Kanna finished, looking her grandson directly in his eyes. Would that be the honorable thing to do, Sokka? Is that what a proud warrior of our tribe would do? Take the life of a man who's unable to defend himself? This seemed to give Sokka pause and Katara hope. What, are you suggesting we wait until he recovers so that it's fair? Yeah, he's defenseless now but won't be for long. Sokka argued, though the seeds of doubt had been sown. What happens if he does turn out to be a firebender, or even just a bad guy? Sorry, but honor won't mean a damn thing when he's killed us all. Perhaps, Kanna acknowledged. But keep in mind he could also prove to be a powerful ally, should that not be the case. That's a pretty big if. Sokka shouted. Anna didn't respond for a time, taking instead to observe the young man and then her tribe. What say you all? There were conflicting mutterings amongst the tribe comprised primarily of mothers. Some were vocal about what they should do, and that was to eliminate the potential threat. Among them, however, just as many were against hurting the young man. Amidst their discussions, his age played a factor in equal parts for action and against it. The consensus being he was young enough to be innocent, but not so young as to be unable to bring onto them a great harm. Listen, everyone. Katara decided to speak up again, and everyone was paying attention. I know we're all scared. I know I am, at least, but I really don't believe he'll hurt us. How can you be so sure? Sokka asked, but this time his question was presented genuinely, not out of anger, and it was mirrored by many. That's the thing, I can't be, Katara admitted reluctantly. But I really do believe if he wanted to hurt us, then he would have done so when you first tried to attack him, or when I approached to bandage his hand. And yes, I know he could be biding his time, but can any of you honestly tell me you'd feel right just outright killing him? No one, not even Sokka, who was looking away now, seemed ready to volunteer for such a grim task. In their uncertain silence, she moved to the stranger's side once more and attempted to turn him over gently, finding this rather difficult to do because despite his size, he was incredibly heavy. When she finally succeeded in doing so, his head fell into her lap, where she allowed it to remain. He remained unconscious, but his expression was pained and suffering. There were tears coming out of his clenched eyes, clear for all to see. She wiped them away but they persisted, and in them Katara found her voice. Believe me, I know the risk we'll face in helping him, but I know we'd be doing the right thing. Just look at him, he's hurting, beginning with her grandmother, who was now smiling at her. Katara locked eyes with everyone in the crowd, finding some of them donning similar expressions. Please, everyone, we have to help him. And we have to do it because I believe it's the right thing to do, and I believe it's who we are. Everyone fell silent into their own consideration, Sokka included, before a woman stepped forward. She was of middle age, walking forward with a smile and a small container of something in her hands. Everyone watched as she joined Katara's side, placing her free hand on her shoulder briefly before pressing a hand to the boy's cheek with affection in her eyes. Some of the anguish on his face subsided, but much still remained. "You know, he would have been the same age as my boy," she said as she moved some of his hair from out of his face, her trembling voice clearly heard in the silence. She began to rub the ointment along the scarring on his chest with a tangible care. Her name was Moku, the tribe's healer. Katara knew her husband and son had been amongst the casualties during the Fire Nation's final attack on their tribe, the same that had claimed the life of her own mother. "And he's about the same age as my son," another woman separated from the crowd. Her name was Mina. Her son was away with the rest of the men, fighting in place of his father, her husband, who had also died at the hands of the Fire Nation. One by one, more women moved forward, joining Katara, some aiding where able, while others merely observed the young man. "Then I believe we've come to a decision," Kana announced as she too joined them. "Thank you, Gran, Katara whispered. "Do not thank me yet, Katara," she warned grimly as she regarded the boy. "The future is not yet written. We do not yet know of his intentions. As such, I will be leaving him in your care. What he does next, my granddaughter, will be a reflection of you, for better or for worse." "I understand," Katara nodded. And she did understand. The decision and responsibility did not come lightly, and it was yet another weight on her shoulders, because even now, she was unsure of whether or not she just doomed her tribe. What she was resolute in, however, was that she'd done the right thing. Of this her heart assured her. Naruto felt an invasive cold permeate his body, penetrating down to his very bones, making everything ache painfully, and his movement stiff. Movement, he realized, was restricted. He was stricken with momentary panic that persisted only until he opened his eyes to discover he was wrapped up to his head in a thick bedding that resembled a sleeping bag made up of a thick skin he couldn't identify and a white fur lining. The room he was in was small and cylindrical, illuminated faintly by the smoldering fire at his bedside. His disorientation was fleeting as everything came back to him all at once. Sasuke's final betrayal resulting in Kurama's ultimate sacrifice. His eyes began to burn. Naruto mourned the absence of his friend, leaving him hollow yet riddled with even more guilt, but he stopped himself short of outright crying. He was not aware of what Kurama had done to save his life, but the fact he still lived was proof enough he'd succeeded at the cost of his own. To have mistaken his greatest act of kindness for an attempt at his life was a mistake Naruto didn't believe he'd ever forgive himself for making. But it was one he'd worked to remedy by apologizing to him, face to face now that he was no longer caged within. It was difficult to accept the fact it may take years. How many, he did not know, but he would see him again. This Naruto promised himself and Kurama. But first, Naruto had to get back to Konoha. He didn't know what had transpired after he lost reason, but from what little he could gather, the planetary devastation Sasuke employed, in conjunction to his cursed flames, had somehow sent him far from home. Though it didn't quite make sense as to why, this much was apparent considering the frigid climate. If he were to offer a guess, he was somewhere in the land of snow. At least that's what he hoped. Naruto, amidst a growing list, regretted never having explored his sensory abilities. He could, at the very least, sense those who didn't actively try to suppress their chakra's presence if he concentrated. He'd done just that in his brief moment of consciousness, sensing only the girl who'd bandaged his hand within whatever the range of his awareness happened to be. That in itself was not his only concerning realization. With what remained of his spent reserves, Naruto attempted to summon a toad in hopes of employing a reverse summons back to Konoha, but his connection to them was now severed. There was no mistaking it as a flawed attempt because in Kurama's absence, control of his own chakra came to him as naturally as breathing. Why exactly he was no longer contracted with the toads, he had absolutely no inclination, and this only added to his worries and the severity of the situation. Something was wrong, it was a feeling he couldn't shake. Naruto heard a light set of footfalls crunching in the snow, growing louder in their approach. Despite being so evidently cared for, he prepared himself by running through a series of hand signs within his loose confines. Taking a deep breath, he lined his lungs with wind nature-infused chakra. He stayed himself seeing the girl from the night before appear, poking her head in first, smiling tentatively upon finding he was awake. He reabsorbed his chakra and released his bated breath through his nose in the form of a drawn-out sigh, visible briefly in the cold. She fully entered the tent, her large blue eyes regarding him curiously. She was certainly pretty, with dark chocolate hair tied into a large braid tossed over her right shoulder, along with twin strands framing her pleasant face tanned a beautiful shade of bronze. Naruto could only contemplate as to what she was saying as she began to speak to him in a language he could not understand nor recognize. And though her language was foreign to him, that of her body was not. He recalled clearly how she so willingly tried to protect him from her own people's judgment. The people consisting entirely of women, children, and a single boy. This gave him pause and more cause for consideration. There was not a single man in sight, and the fact she was the only one he could actively sense only added to the mystery of where he could have possibly ended up. Wherever that may have been must have surely been a ways from the land of fire, as even in the land of snow, they spoke the same language. Upon closer consideration, Naruto wasn't aware of any other language spoken in the entirety of the elemental nations, outside of that belonging to shinobi. Even then, it was still spoken plainly but coded in double meanings, so as to exchange information covertly. But then again, he couldn't exactly claim to have paid much attention to geography lessons during his time in the academy. "I can't understand you," Naruto stated the obvious in a voice he almost didn't recognize. He was incredibly thirsty, and every word spoken tore at his throat. "Do you know where Konoha is?" The girl tilted her head to the right in an admittedly adorable gesture before speaking again. "Konoha, Yakno, the village hidden in the leaves, located in Fire Country." Naruto tried again, repeating the name of his village thrice more, slowly and deliberately. This time, she tilted her head to the left and continued to speak to him. Naruto sighed, finding none of her words sounded remotely familiar, and judging by her sustained confusion, neither did his. "Okay, what about the land of water, earth, snow, anything?" There was no recognition in her eyes, even at the mention of the final land. "Shit." She continued speaking to him as she reached around behind herself to unhook a pouch that had been hanging over her shoulder. She mimicked drinking it before bringing it close to his face, repeating a single word he was certain meant water in her language. "Water?" Naruto repeated slowly. "Water?" The girl nodded with another smile as she brought it closer to his face, stopping to allow him to do the rest. Naruto grimaced as he inclined his head to place his lips around what looked to be a hollow tusk, finding immediate relief in what did turn out to be water. He drank greedily, ignoring the stinging in his throat until nothing remained. "Thank you," Naruto allowed his head to fall back, feeling as if his scratchy eyes and chapped lips were already becoming hydrated. The girl spoke to him some more, rather animatedly at that, and of course he understood none of it. Naruto decided to try something he couldn't have done in his previous frantic state, closing his eyes, he calmed his mind and began to breathe deeply. He ignored the pain in his chest as he focused on drawing in chakra from the world around him, extending his sensing range further. He abruptly opened his eyes, finding the girl's chakra signature was indeed the largest he could sense in as far as his awareness extended. The differences in the chakra she contained and that of the others in the immediate area was that of a jounin and a civilian. Only the girl's pool seemed to be no more than that of an academy student. There was something else he was sensing, but it seemed to be just beyond the scope of his range. Though it could have been an illusion or even a sheer mistake because try as he might, he could not decide whether or not something was really there. The girl gasped, no doubt having witnessed the change in his eyes, but he paid little mind to this, as there was yet another difference which left Naruto dumbfounded. Her very presence visualized within his own mind's eye was somehow different than any he'd ever encountered before, in a way he couldn't exactly put to words, much less reason. "Where am I?" Naruto muttered. The girl poised her own undecipherable question, pointing to his face. Naruto realized then he would make no progress in stagnation. Even though he was exhausted and in constant pain, he knew he had to get moving soon. Even now his wounds were healing and his chakra growing, with his entering sage mode having seemed to accelerate both. That, in itself, turned out to be another change, albeit a welcomed one. In times before, utilizing sage mode had been exhausting, limiting him to only using the augmentation a total of 3 times before he had to recover. Now, he only felt more revitalized and as though his healing rate had also increased. Naruto's thoughts were interrupted upon the girl's approach. She reached forward slowly to untie the bindings that held his sleeping bag shut. As soon as she did, he pulled his arms free, stretching them to find he was dressed in a fur-lined long-sleeved shirt. He pulled at it, finding a majority of his torso and arms to be bandaged. He allowed her to reach for his hand, hearing her gasp in amazement when she removed the scarf she'd wrapped around it the night before. She exclaimed, moving his own hand to show him how he'd recovered. "Yeah, I've always been a fast healer," Naruto said, knowing full well she would not understand. She removed her glove with her teeth, holding it there as she traced her soft thumb along the rough and calloused surface of his palm, her amazement growing at the physical confirmation his wound was indeed healed and gone. The very same wound the boy had given him, if indirectly, despite being very much intentional. Naruto acknowledged the fact they'd clothed, sheltered, attempted to heal, and now offered him water was proof enough his unexpected entrance must have startled them into action. Even now he was unrestrained with a girl who looked only a few years younger than he in age. If their aim was to harm him, they would have done so when he was unconscious, defenseless, and exposed. Naruto knew he had the girl before him to thank for that, recalling how she literally placed herself between himself and those of her village. All for a stranger. "Thank you," Naruto decided a proper show of appreciation was in order, doing so with an accompanying bow. She looked confused again, letting go of his hand rather quickly, muttering what could have potentially been an apology, as indicated by her tone. "I really gotta go now," he said, sitting up to stand. In doing so he winced again. He was healing, but he wasn't fully so yet. She said something out of concern now, placing a gentle hand to his chest, likely urging him to remain in place. He returned the gesture by carefully moving her hand away with a placating smile of his own, though it didn't reach his eyes. He gestured to himself and then to the tent's entrance. The girl was conflicted but eventually stood up and off to the side. He thanked her again before coming to a stand, finding his pants and sandals at least remained in place, although he would be needing a new pair soon, considering they were burned in certain inopportune places, exposing sections of his green boxers. Naruto had a spare change of clothes, but changing in front of a young girl was unlikely to ingratiate him with anyone. Not that it would matter considering he would be leaving soon, but he would be sure to return one day to more properly offer his thanks for their eventual hospitality. Stepping out of the tent into the frigid morning air, Naruto decided his current state of dress, barring his pants and sandals, were likely for the best. He found the boy from the night before near the entrance, clearly his assigned guard. Only he was seated on a chair sculpted from snow, snoring loudly and drooling with a spear that had since been discarded in his sleep. He glanced at the girl who'd followed him out, receiving a sheepish smile in response and an accompanying shrug of her shoulders. The sudden shout pulled his attention from her to a young girl, likely no older than 10, who was pointing at him. It didn't take long for a mass of women and children to begin pouring out of similar tents in what appeared to be a small encampment erected in the very snow itself, protected by a wall of snow, ice, and wood. The camp appeared very primitive in that there were no signs of electricity, running water, or any such amenities. Their clothing was also rather primitive and more immediately taken from nature itself in the form of processed animal skin and furs. They were all still clearly weary of him, well, most of them. Mothers pushed their young behind themselves to rein in their curiosity as they struggled to prevent them from trying to see him. Their cautious expressions were grimly familiar and it only confirmed that which he'd already suspected. They were alone. There were no men present, only young boys and women of varying ages. It was possible their men were simply out on a hunt or perhaps they'd been sent out to partake in the Fourth Shinobi War. Though he couldn't recall having witnessing any forces resembling any of the present in attire, it wasn't outside the realm of possibility. Sokka. The spearhead was mere inches from his nose, drawing a gasp of fear from the women and children. The boy shouted something at him, a command clearly, inching the spear closer to him. The cursory glance in the light of day revealed the boy's weak constitution. He had some training, of this there was no doubt, but nothing of the boy alluded to true discipline. His openings were many, and his attack from the night before had been slow. Even though he'd since relinquished his sage mode and he was far from being healed, the boy before him presented to him no real threat. But Naruto had no intention of provoking or instilling any more fear into those who had saved him. Slowly, he raised his hands in a placating manner, keeping his expression even. Sokka. It must have been his name or their equivalent to the word stop because the boy did just that, looking to the crowd. As did Naruto, though never once did he allow the weapon or the boy to leave his peripherals. The woman, older than most and of clear importance, stepped forward. Her status was evident in how everyone parted to allow her unobstructed access to the scene, most looking to her as if hanging on her every word. The boy shouted something but was interrupted by the older woman, her words firm and resolute despite the language barrier. He recognized her from the night before, along with just how much the girl who ultimately helped save him argued with her. Reluctantly, the boy pulled his spear back, but not his glare or suspicious demeanor. He clearly didn't trust him, and Naruto couldn't exactly blame him as it appeared their protection fell solely on his shoulders. What a sorry state they must have found themselves in for this to be the case. Thank you for helping me, Naruto stepped forward but made sure to keep enough distance from the gathered group. It would not reflect favorably on himself if he neared the most vulnerable of their people any further. He punctuated his words with a respectful bow, hoping this at least they would understand. The older woman studied him for a time before offering a smile, returning his gesture herself. There was an almost tangible wave of relief from all present. Deciding there would be no better person to ask, Naruto kneeled, placing his hands upon his knees in what he hoped was a further disarming gesture. Do you know about Konoha? Or any of the other lands? He repeated their names once more, repeating that of the land of snow multiple times. Surely she of all people was likely to recognize the land he thought them to be. The woman looked just as confused as the girl had, even their eyes creasing in much the same way. Speaking of the girl, she moved to stand at his side to address the woman herself, explaining something to her. Despite the elder woman's previous gesture and demeanor, she tensed at their close proximity. Naruto observed this and opted to remain as still as possible. The woman said something to the girl before turning to another woman, speaking to her briefly before waving her away. The woman rushed away and in the meantime, the elder motioned to another woman. The girl at his side met the woman halfway to accept another water pouch, along with something wrapped in a cloth. She returned to him, presenting them to him with another beautiful smile. His final clash with Sasuke had changed Naruto in more ways than one. He couldn't help but to silently chastise the girl for her naivety in being so kind and carefree around who amounted to nothing more than a stranger. Her people were right to be cautious of him. It was something he was remiss to admit he may have done in the past. But not anymore. He accepted their offerings with another thanks and bow, his newfound outlook trounced by his hunger and thirst. He drank half of the water first, and then bit into what must have been dried meat that somehow tasted familiar and very different from that which he'd had before. Whatever it was tasted delicious as he washed it down with the remainder of the water. He supposed he was still a fool in his own right for having accepted that which could have very well been poisoned, thinking perhaps he might not have learned his lesson after all, in believing their intentions towards him to be selfless. The girls were, at the very least. The woman who departed earlier returned with a rolled-up piece of paper that looked very much like a scroll. She handed it to the elder, who herself began to approach him. Once more the girl moved to intercept, but the elder did not relinquish her hold of the scroll, instead crossing the remaining distance to join him. This was against what he perceived to be the advice of some of the women, the boy included, as she came to kneel before him. Naruto met her eyes, finding them as similar but wise in shade of blue as the girl's own, who had since kneeled by his side once more. They must have been related. The permanent creases of the woman's eyes, along with her composure alluding to a long life of experience, reminded him much of Sarutobi Hiruzen. She spoke as she unfurled what turned out to be a map, pointing to a small landmass located near the bottom of the other masses. Naruto's stomach dropped as he studied the map, its legend little more than scribbles, proving to be in a language he was certain he'd never before encountered. More important than even that, he couldn't recognize any of the lands on the map. What he was seeing in no ways resembled the elemental nations. There were 7 landmasses in total, more if he counted a few small clusters, but they didn't seem to have any lettering to identify them as something of importance. Even using his wildest imagination, Naruto couldn't make the map fit that which he remembered. The woman once more pointed at the southernmost landmass, and then motioned to all that surrounded them. Next, she pointed to him, and then to the map, clearly asking him where he was from. No, this has to be wrong, Naruto shook his head, with cracks beginning to appear in his composure. This doesn't look like any map I've ever seen. Why is everything so spread out? Where's the land of fire? Where's anything? That's when he recalled having a map of his own, just not the other contents within. Naruto palmed his left forearm harshly, where he housed a seal only visible in use. It was a trick he picked up from Jiraiya, one employed by shinobi deep in enemy territory where one could not afford to carry a heavy pack. The sudden appearance of the scroll in a pop and small plume of smoke elicited further unrest from all around, with the exception of the woman, who only looked on in clear interest. He unfurled the scroll, pressing his hand at its center where another plume of smoke briefly obscured what was within. When it finally cleared, it did so to reveal 2 ration bars, a map, and 3 sharp kunai which glinted dangerously in the sun. Naruto caught the spear intended for his neck with his left hand, never once breaking eye contact with the elder, as he held up his right hand in a placating gesture, slowly indicating his own map. The woman observed him closely, clearly seeing just how much the boy struggled to pull his spear away from Naruto's grasps, even going as far as placing his foot on his shoulder for leverage, only to fail to budge him so much as an inch. She uttered what might have been his name again, sternly, motioning him away. It took the girl pulling him away to get the boy to finally relinquish his hold on the spear. Naruto tossed it off to the side and allowed his hands to slowly return to their place atop his knees. She finally reached for the scroll, unfurling it to reveal his map of the elemental nations. He pointed at himself and then to the land of fire, Konoha more specifically, repeating the name slowly as he pressed his finger to the map. The woman studied it for a time, Naruto in turn doing the same, only his focus was on her eyes for any signs of recognition. Unfortunately, when she returned his stare, it was with a profound sadness that, without the need for words, told him all he needed to know. He was much further from home than he could have ever possibly imagined. Katara stepped out of her tent and into the brisk morning air when her brother's snoring became too much to bear. She stretched some, waving with a yawn to a couple of her fellow tribespeople. The 2 women stopped their rather gruesome work of skinning a large tiger seal to wave back at her, the fruits of the mysterious young man's latest successful hunt. Thinking of him, whose name she'd yet to learn, Katara was drawn to his tent located near the entrance of their camp, seeing no smoke rising from within. This indicated he was already up and out doing whatever it was he took to doing, all on his own. Following a rather tense integration into a reasonably circumspect southern water tribe, he'd quite often taken to disappearing for hours on end. The first time he'd done so, everyone, herself included, assumed he'd simply left, never to return. Only he did return, and he did so with what would become a proper feast for them all in the form of a polar leopard slung over his shoulder, showing no signs of strain nor injury, despite having faced one of the most fierce predators in their lands, all on his own. Katara often wondered what he got up to in his time alone, outside of hunting for the tribe, but with a barrier in the form of language between them, she couldn't exactly ask him. Nor was she in any position to follow after him, considering his prey were often apex predators, known to be extremely dangerous to even experienced hunting parties. Not even on the rare occasions when he could be found roaming their small encampment could she work up the nerve to approach him, especially when she had no real reason to. Not anymore. Any and all of his needs were met by his own means. Beyond that, he didn't exactly seem at all interested in interacting with anyone outside of Gura, their tribe's educator. Her grandmother revealed she'd been teaching him their language, or at the very least attempting to. If he was making any progress in that regard, he certainly didn't make it known. She often considered asking Gura herself how the lessons were coming along, but that in itself felt like an invasion of his privacy. There existed, however, one reason beyond all else that made it difficult for her to interact with him, differing languages aside. That being his overall demeanor. After all, Katara didn't exactly need words to realize he was sad. Whoever he really was, wherever he came from, he was now very far from home. After coming to that realization alongside them, any and all semblance of the boy she'd saved that night disappeared entirely. He'd since become entirely stoic, his expression locked in its default, eyes often unfocused and missing that vibrant luster they held for all of a single night. What anguished her the most was not knowing how to help him. Katara's mind remained on the young man as she watched the children of the two women hard at work emerge from their tents, taking to playing around and frustrating their hard-working mothers with their antics. But this sight, a smile blossomed on her face, knowing that their tribe as a whole seemed to breathe easier since his arrival as food stores, and even their safety, were no longer an immediate concern. If only she could express to him how thankful she was, how thankful they all were, for his actions. If only she could repay the favor by somehow easing his own sorrows. Worry not, granddaughter, he's probably just out hunting again. Katara startled hearing her grandmother's voice so abruptly beside her. Her tent was located right next to her and Sokka's, but she wasn't exactly an early riser in her advanced age, so she hadn't been expecting, nor did she notice her approach. Oh, good morning, Gran. Katara's smile was that of embarrassment. Her grandmother's odd smile made that feeling intensify for some reason. You know, Katara, I cannot express just how relieved I am we listened to you that day, Candace said as she moved closer to her side, wrapping an arm around her granddaughter. He's only been with us a short time, and already he's done so much for the tribe. Yeah, she agreed, now feeling awkward. She always appreciated and welcomed her grandmother's praise, only she wasn't exactly certain she was deserving of it then, considering he was the one doing so much. Our food reserves were much lower than I would have liked to admit, and your brother, bless his heart, could only do so much to replenish them with fish alone, Candace said, taking to observing the women at work herself. Meat had become a rather scarce commodity in the years since the men had gone, with Sokka only managing to trap the occasional collator. Otherwise they'd been relegated to a mostly fish diet. Beyond the aspect of food, crucial materials used for items such as clothing, linens, and shelter had also become dangerously low, as most of said materials were sourced from some of the more dangerous animals. Since the blonde young man's unexpected and unexplainable arrival just 2 weeks prior, he'd brought back 5 tiger seals, 3 whale walruses, and 2 polar leopards. But I suppose that's not what's worrying you? Candace said, tightening her hold on Katara briefly. No, she elongated the single word in confusion. Nothing's worrying me right now, Gran. Well, nothing outside the usual. It went without saying she was referring to her father, the other tribesmen, and the uncertainty of whether or not they were even still alive. All that could be done about that was to retain their faith in hopes of one day seeing them on the horizon once more, this time in return as Appas to a send-off. Anna hummed in a way that indicated perhaps she didn't exactly believe her. Have you tried speaking with him lately? It's not like we'd really have anything to talk about, Katara answered before thinking, all but confirming the accuracy of her grandmother's intuition. I mean, no, Gran, I haven't. It's not like he would even understand me. I think you'd be surprised, Candace said as she released her. He's a quick learner from what I hear. As Katara was intrigued, but tried not to make this so obvious. Has he said anything to you? Do you know his name? No one seemed to know it, her grandmother included, it would seem. Oh, I doubt he'd have much to say to this old lady, Canna chuckled softly. Though I'd say he would certainly benefit from having someone closer to his age to speak with. A friend, perhaps. Of course her grandmother, the smartest and wisest person she'd ever known, had also taken notice of his dour behavior. Maybe, Katara muttered, unsure of where her sudden reluctance was stemming from. Think about it, yes. Kana patted her shoulder, starting back towards her tent. Before someone else beats you to it. Huh? Katara didn't get the opportunity to fully process what her grandmother had just said, much less the implications, when a childish shout of glee garnered the attention of all. He's back. The children halted their games to gather around the open gates, waving excitedly to something in the distance. Katara followed their line of sight to see a hulking figure on the approach, obscured faintly by the sun rising behind. The bulk, she realized, was that of a monster southern polar bear, and it had to have been double, no, triple his size. Yet, he didn't at all appear to be under any strain, as he carried it leisurely over his right shoulder. He acknowledged the children with a nod, returning their smiles with an awkward imitation of his own. The expression seemed forced and never reached his sullen eyes. Oh my, an unwed young woman amidst those amassed fronded her flushed face as she approached him. Whatever would we do without you? Naruto once more nodded, this time without the smile, before dropping his kill near the women at the processing station. He dipped into a nearby bucket of water, washing away the blood from his hair and some from his face, finishing by running a hand through his damp growing hair to slick it back. In her peripherals, Katara saw the older of the two women elbow the other, who like many of the other women, had been staring, so as to return to their work now doubled. Her grandmother's words sounded in her mind then, urging her forward, waving as she neared him, just as he dried his face and hair off with a nearby towel. Hey, Katara began but found herself suddenly struggling to find her next words. Good hunting this morning, I see. He stared at her for a time, expressionless, making her question what level of understanding, if any, he had of their language. And just when it almost became too difficult to maintain eye contact with him, he nodded. This, unfortunately, was no real indication of anything because that's just how he tended to express himself to others. So, how are you adjusting to our tribe? Katara decided to press on, if nothing else, to further test his handle of their language. Although following a brief moment's consideration, she regretted the question she had presented to him. Whether or not he understood her, it wasn't exactly the most sensitive when considering their assumptions of his circumstances. I mean, you know, it's a little cold today, no. It was always cold. She had to resist the urge to shrink away from sheer mortification at her continued fumbling of the one-sided conversation, making her question her own grasp of her native and only language. As much as she wanted to speak with him, to get to know him, she had no inclination on how to even initiate. His only response was a single grunt. Despite her sympathies for him and her own frazzled nerves, Katara frowned. Can you even understand me? My gran said you've been working with Gura to learn our language. His expression didn't change, but hers certainly did at his response. Yes. You could talk this whole time? Katara continued to flounder in speaking before she could truly consider her own words. Well, I mean, how long could you understand our language? How long could you speak it? I am still learning, he spoke slowly, carefully, and with a deep vocal fry. His voice was much more profound than what she remembered it being upon his first arrival. I do not know many words. That's great. Katara smiled. I've got so many questions. That is, if that's okay with you. No. Katara was stricken speechless in the wake of his outright denial of her curiosity. She supposed it was to be expected, but somehow she was still taken aback by just how blatant he was in doing so. She couldn't help but feel the slightest bit irked and maybe even a little hurt. Okay, she lengthened the word nervously. Can I at least know your name, then? Mine's Katara, by the way. Perhaps small steps were in order. It does not matter, his answer was cold and dismissive. Without anything further said, he began to walk away, leaving her standing in a state of stunned astonishment. Hey. Katara called out after him as he neared his tent. What's your problem? He stopped in his tracks, but he did not turn to face her. His possible feelings and circumstances were no longer of concern to her in the wake of his impudent demeanor. His inaction persisted long enough for Katara to realize she'd actually shouted at him amidst all her tribe. She felt her cheeks grow warm at being the sudden center of attention, but she felt justified in her question. We're only trying to help. The least you could do is give us your name. Katara resumed her march, seeing him begin for his tent again. Are you even listening to me? He looked back to her from over his shoulder, and suddenly she was reminded of who she was shouting at. Although his expression didn't change, something instinctual within alerted her of the mistake she'd made in confronting the same man who'd fallen from the sky, easily disarmed her brother. And frequently displayed superhuman strength in hunting predators only parties of grown men could ever hope to fell. But that established, Katara didn't believe, no, she somehow knew he wouldn't hurt her, but the warning was undoubtedly there. She'd just overstepped a boundary. Katara, what are you shouting about this early in the morning? Sokka made a brusque appearance from their tent, yawning while rubbing his eyes, completely oblivious to what he interrupted. Katara decided right then and there that if he wasn't willing to be open with her, with them, then she would no longer care. Fine, be that way. Katara was stomping away now. See if I care. Come on, Sokka, we're going fishing, I'm getting tired of meat. We are. Sokka, who was still fighting off sleep, yelped when she grabbed him by the collar, pulling him along. Wait, you mentioned something about meat. Hey, Katara, at least let me eat something first. Naruto watched them go, feeling the beginnings of guilt stirring within at a reaction as a result of his own. But he could barely stand even himself these days, and he was in no mood to recount his life story. One filled with a myriad of mistakes begetting even more regrets. Beyond such feelings of remorse for his past missteps, there existed a larger feeling of despair. Even now, he was unsure of what he was supposed to do with himself anymore. Of course he'd yet to give up on the hope of finding a way back home, but as he was currently, no such hope existed. He was stranded in what he could only theorize was another world entirely. His battle with Kagaya had introduced him to the reality of interdimensional travel. There was no other way of explaining the discrepancies in their lands and languages otherwise. With his connection to the Toad severed, the only remote possibility of returning home lay in the extraordinary complex form of the sealing arts. To his very limited knowledge, they were the only other medium potentially accessible to him capable of creating and accessing pocket dimensions. Short of possessing the Sharingan or the powers of a god, of which he had neither, there was no other way. At least none he could think of. The trouble stemmed from his base-level understanding of seals, and that was if he was being generous with himself. Had he listened to his betters instead of assuming he knew better than them, then perhaps he wouldn't have been quite so unprepared, because currently, his only knowledge of seals was how to draw them for basic storage. But he could do so, not out of any semblance of an understanding of their complexities, but from memory alone. This shortfall was yet another in a list of regrets, ever growing in hindsight. After all, he spent nearly 3 years traveling with a renowned Fuinjutsu practitioner in Jiraiya. But of course he was far too busy pestering his sensei for new techniques and arguing over his quest to save the very person who'd ultimately doomed him to even consider other avenues of bettering himself as a shinobi. Naruto truly found himself without recourse, and he hated himself knowing ultimately he was the only one to blame. There did, potentially, exist another option. This was to wander the current world in which he inhabited in search of another way and more information. Only this would prove difficult to do because he'd landed on the southernmost continent of this new world, surrounded by unknown distances of nothing but water. Water he could absolutely traverse on foot but couldn't exactly sleep on. In lieu of simply giving up, resigning himself to a life of living amongst a people he did not belong to, his only other viable option was to buy his passage to the other lands. This was his current half-hearted plan. One he'd already initiated by sowing the seeds of gratitude with the tribe by hunting for them whilst he attempted to learn their language. However, his lack of consideration and foresight once again presented itself by angering one of their members. One who seemed particularly close and was likely related to the tribe elder herself. The same girl who had saved his life and had done nothing but show him kindness, a kindness he repaid with scorn. Naruto suppressed the whirlwind running wild in his mind to look to the aforementioned tribe elder, finding her watching him with clear disapproval on her weathered face. Before he could do anything to further sour himself with the woman, he decided to request passage first and take it if it was denied to him. Although he didn't want to resort to such methods of cruelty, being kind was what had stranded him in an unfamiliar world to begin with. He could no longer afford to be unilaterally considerate, not to those who didn't deserve it, and especially not when it proved detrimental. You know, my granddaughter may be young, curious, and perhaps even a little headstrong at times, the woman began, her words spoken slowly, clearly, and purposefully. But I assure you her intentions are nothing but pure. I am sorry, Naruto bowed respectfully to her. He also wasted no time in presenting his objective. I need help. Seeing as you've been helping our tribe by hunting for us, if it is within my power, I will try and oblige. I need to leave to other lands, Naruto requested, finding to his frustration, he continued to struggle to form even basic sentences. I need a ship. He'd taken to using his clones to expedite his learning within the privacy of his tent as he slept and when he was out on a hunt. His progress was steady, but learning a new language proved incredibly difficult and he was growing impatient. I see, the woman's lips thinned. Has Gura discussed the current state of our lands to you yet? She had not. Their lessons, up to that point, revolved solely around language. It had been especially demeaning being seated amidst a class of toddlers in the early days of his studies, but he knew it was a crucial step in the right direction. No. Naruto decided to keep the true extent of his predicament to himself, so it was likely the tribe was operating under the assumption he was, at the absolute very least, of their world. As such, he would know the state of world politics. The woman's question, however, indicated she suspected this not to be the case. He realized he hadn't exactly helped maintain this assumption by showing her his own map of the elemental nations. So am I to assume you are unaware of the Fire Nation and their war against the other nations? She continued with her probing questions. I do not need a lesson. I need to leave, Naruto reiterated with mounting frustration. Though he couldn't exactly deny his interest, if there was one thing he had learned, or at the very least learned to acknowledge, it was that human nature persisted as it always did. He doubted it was any different in this world, perpetuating a cycle of cruelty never ending. The only favorable change that ever resulted from war belonged to the victors, who often rewrote history to justify their means to an end. Jiraiya had informed him of this fact once before, early on in their trip, long before revealing his more optimistic inner ambitions of breaking that very cycle. Whatever the current conflict which inflicted the world was of no concern to him. If he was treated with hostility, he would repay it in kind. Nevertheless, I think you should know the nearest landmass would be that of the former Southern Air Nation. But I'm afraid you'll find nothing but Fire Nation occupied lands now, and I assure you they do not take kindly to those who are not of their kind. Beyond that would be the Earth Nation, who are more of a neutral nation, at least to those not belonging to the Fire Nation. Whatever it is you are looking for, I imagine that may be best place to begin, she punctuated her explanation with a sigh. However, even if I wish to help you with this, I'm afraid all of our seafaring ships are currently in use by our tribe to fight the Fire Nation. All we have currently are nothing more than canoes used solely for fishing. None of which will get you very far, she finished. There is no way off this land. Naruto wanted to make certain nothing was lost in translation. Not until the men of our tribe return. That is if they do return, she informed him solemnly. She then motioned for her tent. If you'll follow me, young man, I'd like to learn more of your situation myself. Perhaps this way I can be of more help in getting you back to your home. No. He obviously had more to consider before deciding how to proceed. Hours later, Naruto was forcefully pulled from his failed attempt at meditation by a sudden outburst of something that closely resembled a powerful spike of chakra. Whatever it may be, it was powerful enough to reach his senses without actively having to concentrate. The pang of anxiety shot through him, thinking immediately of the girl, the only one he could actually actively sense. But somehow, this signature felt far different from Katara's own presence, outshining anything he sensed from her prior. He was going to investigate it. Naruto may have decided not to involve himself in any conflicts not his own, but neither could he ignore the possibility Katara may have found herself in some form of danger. He did, at the very least, owe her that much. That and his life. When he opened his tent he did so in time to see a great light fading in the distance. The tribe's women and children had also witnessed it, pointing in the direction with clear concern. Amongst them was the tribe's elder, who approached him moving faster than anyone her age had any right doing. I know I have no right to ask this of you, but that light, it came from the direction my grandchildren are supposed to be, any and all of her previous composure was gone. Please, I beg of. Naruto was already gone, disappearing in a burst of single-directional speed, utilizing the Shunshin technique. He stopped briefly when he reached the water's edge, taking that moment to try and concentrate in an effort to sense the girl without having to waste time entering his sage state. Almost immediately, he sensed a presence again, and this time he was certain it was not Katara's. The signature itself was much weaker now, just barely within his range, but unmistakable nevertheless. With this, he began to speed across the water. It didn't take him long to reach the source of the signature, and with it, a surprising sight. His immediate attention was drawn to Katara, who was well and unharmed, as was her brother. What did surprise Naruto was the presence of a very young boy with a large blue arrow on his bare head, with two more present on each of his hands, above his knuckles, dressed in an orange tunic above a yellow shirt and pants. As if that wasn't a spectacle in itself, they all rode atop a giant creature with thick white fur, complete with a large gray arrow of its own, located between a pair of equally large horns. It ceased its swimming, having noticed him first. Katara noticed him next. You're a waterbender. Her proclamation drew the attention of the two boys, both equally surprised to see him. Holy shit. Is he really just standing on top of the water? Sokka shouted. Seriously, can everyone but me use magic around here? I told you it's not. Katara shook her head to reorient herself. How are you just standing on the water right now? Are you a waterbender or not? Naruto approached them, making sure to keep his distance from the massive creature, whose sole attention remained on him. Oh look, he can walk on water too, Sokka rested his chin on his hand, sighing. Yeah, sure, because why not? I mean, if you can just stand on water then yeah, of course you can walk on water too. Whoa, I didn't know waterbenders could do that. The bald boy erupted with equally youthful excitement. In fact, he was practically vibrating in place, much like a child being presented with a new toy, just out of arm's reach. I wanna learn how to do that too. But you're an airbender, and that looks like a waterbending technique, Katara began by addressing the boy and finished by glaring at Naruto accusingly. Besides, he doesn't even want to tell me his name, I doubt he'd help you with anything. Oh, yeah, right, the boy named Ong chuckled sheepishly. So what, are you just gonna stand there and pretend you don't understand me? Katara's eyes were narrowed. Are you, or are you not, a waterbender? I do not know what that is, Naruto dismissed the notion. Although their words were further proof others with abilities existed, but it was neither the place nor time to discuss it. Your bossy ate your grandmother? She was worried, so she sent you? Katara interrupted furiously. Is that it? She proceeded to answer her own question before ever giving him a chance. Of course it is. It's not like you'd even care if I got hurt. Naruto sighed, looking to the older boy next. Everything is alright then? I guess so. We just so happened to stumble across this bold airbender kid and his pet stuck in the ice. Oh yeah, he also glowed for a bit, you know, nothing too crazy or anything, Sokka said, glancing at the bold boy with the same look of distrust he usually regarded him with. That was until he realized something, snapping back to him with eyes wide and a finger pointed in his direction. Hey. Since when can you talk? Before Naruto could translate the words needed to ask for clarification regarding their discovery of the boy in the ice, Sokka and Aang began to argue amongst themselves. Hey, Appa's not my pet. He's my best friend. Aang proclaimed. Your best friend is a big hairy monster. Yikes, Sokka muttered sarcastically. Talk about pathetic. This seemed to further annoy the boy. He's not a monster either. I told you already, he's a sky bison. Tomatoes, potatoes. That's not how that expression goes, Katara muttered. Ooh, do you have some? Just like that, Aang was no longer angry. Now he was drooling while patting his stomach, beginning to advance on the older boy. I'm starving. Hey, wait, stay away from me. I've got no food for you. Sokka shrunk away from the boy. You're not the only one who's hungry. I'll have you know I was forced to skip breakfast this morning. I haven't eaten anything since last night. Do you know what that's like? Hey, I said back. Go on, get. Naruto shut his eyes, exhaling through his nose in a drawn-out sigh. He opened them to address Sokka again. You two are well then. There is no danger. Yeah, whatever man, we're fine. Everything's just peachy, he said with a roll of his eyes, all while keeping Aang at bay with his foot. Why are you only asking him, huh? Katara snapped, even angrier now. Is it because I'm a girl? Am I being too emotional to be bothered with? Or is it that you just think I'm too dumb to explain, so you have to ask another man for clarification? The water beneath his feet was growing rather tumultuous, while both boys atop the giant creature inched away from her ever so slightly. Naruto had no inclination as to what that was supposed to mean, or further yet, why she was so angry, but neither did he particularly care enough in that moment to find out. They were safe, the bald young boy's unrestrained childlike curiosity seemed too genuine to be a ruse. He didn't appear to be of any threat, especially now that he seemed to be cowering away from Katara. Seeing they were in no immediate danger, and being altogether tired of the situation, Naruto promptly turned around and disappeared from view again, returning to the tribe in only a few flashes. Upon doing so, the elder immediately rushed to him. Where are Katara and Sokka? They are safe, Naruto answered simply. They are on the way back now. The light, what was it? Naruto did not answer as he made his way back to his tent, this time with more immediate intentions in mind. He could no longer afford to be wasting his time. So, Sokka lengthened the word awkwardly. What are we supposed to do with him? Unbeknownst to Katara, her brother was trying to be careful so as to not set her off again. Their long trip back to their tribe had been traversed in near silence, especially when Aang had fallen into a deep sleep neither could stir him from. Now that they'd arrived, she searched the gathered crowd for any signs of him, but found none. With as many more questions as she had following his displays of possible water bending, this only frustrated her further. Katara. Sokka waved a hand in her face. Hello, you there? Huh? She blinked away her disassociation. What? Geez, Katara. I was asking what you were gonna do with your second stray here. Sokka nudged the sleeping boy with his foot. He's still really out of it. I even poked him a few times, but he doesn't seem to want to wake up. I don't know, she said following a sigh and jumped down from the massive bison. Just take him to our tent for now, I guess. What? Why our tent and why do I have to do it? Sokka griped. Because that jerk took our only free tent. Katara snapped at him. And whose fault is that? Sokka muttered as he pushed Aang off the bison with his foot, the boy falling face first into the snow. Her brother jumped down next to him and picked him up, hoisting him roughly over his shoulder. Even still, he remained sound asleep. No need to bite my head off just because you and your boyfriend are fighting. Don't just throw Aang like that. And he's not my. Katara, Sokka. Their grandmother was the first to react, running to hug her. What happened? We saw a light and who is that boy? You're never going to believe what just happened, Gran, Katara muttered. It can't be any more unbelievable than a boy falling from the sky, Kana pulled back with a smile that broadcasted her sheer relief. When he returned without you two Why did you have to send him? Katara couldn't hide the bitterness in her voice. Katara? Kana was taken aback by the question and how it was presented. I was worried and he's the only capable fighter in our tribe. Who else would I have sent? Ouch, Gran, ouch, Sokka muttered with a deadpan. It's not like he even cares, Katara crossed her arms with a frown. He just showed up, walking on water, might I add, and just as quickly left us behind. He can walk on water you say? Kana seemed thoughtful, but somehow not entirely surprised at hearing this. I was wondering how he managed to reach you two. He disappeared before I could even tell him where to find a canoe. Yeah, that was kinda weird, Sokka added. He literally vanished from sight. 1 minute he was there and the next, poof. He indicated by waving the fingers of his free hand. Such speed and the ability to walk on water, Kana was clearly working something out within her thoughts. Abilities only no, it couldn't be. Could it? Yeah, we get it, he's cool and all that, but are we all just gonna continue ignoring the bald kid passed out on my shoulder? Sokka shrugged the shoulder the boy was sleeping on to prove his point. He's getting kinda heavy and, hey. Is he drooling on me? I swear I feel something wet. Gross. Take him to your tent for the time being. Katara, you come with me. I wish to know what happened, Kana instructed. Man, what's the point of being the village leader if everyone's always telling me what to do? Sokka muttered as he began walking away. Sokka do this, Sokka do that. Sokka, carry the drooling bald kid to your tent. And hey, while you're at it, why don't you go ahead and give him your bed too? Maybe even the clothes off your own back? Sure, why not? But wait, does anyone ever care about what Sokka wants or has to say? No, because why would they? It's not like dad left me in charge or anything. No respect, I swear. His complaints were fading but persisted as he walked away. As you can all see, everything is just fine. There is no need to fear, Kana addressed the tribe as a whole, a majority of which were focused on the air bison sleeping in the snow. Everyone resume what you were doing while I speak with my granddaughter. There were nervous mutterings despite her grandmother's guidance, but many mentioned the young man Katara was angry with. And she only grew angrier hearing their words of reassurance, now that he was with them, some touting him as the tribe's protector. Why does everyone seem so confident in him? Katara asked as they entered the privacy of her grandmother's tent. All he does all day is sulk and grunt. I mean, we don't even know his name. He also provides, Kana offered with a small smile as she took her place by the fireside. The question is, why is it that you seem so upset with him? Are you kidding me? He's nothing but a Katara remembered who she was speaking to. Taking a moment to compose herself, she continued with more reservation. He's hiding a lot from us, Gran. I mean, he can hunt animals that would normally take entire hunting parties, all by himself. That's not even mentioning he can walk on water and he's extremely fast. No one should be able to do that. Quite interesting indeed, Kana's smile remained in place. But if this old woman remembers correctly, it was your decision to help him that night. Are you telling me you're already beginning to regret it? No, Katara's head fell in shame. Even though she knew it wasn't intentional, her grandmother's words, especially how she presented them, made her feel foolish by holding a mirror up to her own behavior. Katara, I know you're curious about him and that you feel frustrated that he isn't being very forthcoming, but have you stopped to truly consider the position he's in? Kana presented patiently. When you first found him, he was gravely injured and couldn't speak a single word in our language. Wherever he's from, he's certainly far from it now, on a landmass he has no way off of. His apparent ability to walk on water withstanding. Tell me, were you in his situation, would you be content? Katara's head fell further in the logic presented to her. All of which she already knew, but somehow seemed to forget. No, she repeated, quietly and with even more shame. Be patient with him, Kana advised, lifting her head by her chin. He'll come around, you'll see. And just so you know, earlier, he wasted no time in running to you and your brother. I truly believe he would have gone to find you too, even if I hadn't asked. This gave her pause and something to consider. He did. Her grandmother nodded and smiled. I'm sorry Gran, Katara felt even worse at the confirmation. You silly girl, you've nothing to apologize for, Kana palmed her cheek. At least not to me. Yeah, Katara wholeheartedly agreed, but was unsure whether or not she could face him right then. Her impatience had truly gotten the better of her. I'll admit, I am curious about him as well, Kana said, returning to her seated position. But that can wait. For now, would you mind telling me about this other boy? Katara recounted the events of the day, tactfully omitting the argument between herself and her brother, leading to their discovery of the boy deep within the ice. Through it all, her grandmother listened intently. An airbender, you say? Kana hummed thoughtfully. And from the southern air tribe no less. What interesting times we now find ourselves in. Katara was in agreement in that regard. But Gran, he doesn't seem to know about the war or even what happened to his people. I assume you've yet to tell him anything about that, correct? Kana asked cautiously. No, Katara shook her head sadly. I mean, I don't think I can. He's just so, I don't know, happy, so innocent. I just couldn't, and honestly, I don't think I should be the one to tell him. Perhaps, Kana nodded in understanding. But you know, he does have to find out one way or another. I know, Gran, but when he discovers what happened to his people, he'll be crushed, Katara muttered. He's only a boy. No one should have to go through that. Anna observed her for a time before smiling. I am very proud of the woman you're becoming, she said abruptly. Your empathy, you remind me very much of your mother when she was your age. I saw her in you that night, you know, when you did everything you could to defend that young man. You can even say your actions shook some sense into this old woman. Thanks, Gran. Katara felt her cheeks burning at her grandmother's praise again, though being reminded of her mother didn't exactly make her happy. Naruto was stirred from his dark thoughts by a commotion outside. He had spent the previous evening packing away and sealing any supplies he would need for his upcoming journey. He had accrued enough meat to last him at least a month, in combination to the rations he already possessed. His only concern being freshwater, but it was a risk he would have to take. Although he'd already decided to journey to another land in search of a way home, the existence of the bold boy alluded to the fact there was much more to the current world than he first assumed. Dimensions of water and airbending supported this, all while confusing him further. He had to find answers he wouldn't find in isolation. It would be worth attempting a journey to another land, even if that meant using a canoe to do so. But he would also have to keep his expectations in check, lest he be crushed by a different reality. Despite his own half-hearted conviction, Naruto couldn't help but feel some guilt at leaving the tribe, especially in their sorry state. But he'd done all he could for them in his time, repaying their hospitality with large quantities of meat. Short of staying indefinitely, there was little else he could do for them. His decision to leave so abruptly, in parts, was urged on by the bottle of sake Jiraiya had gifted him on his 16th birthday. He kept it securely sealed away alongside 2 books, one of which belonged to his father. The second was one his godfather had been working diligently on throughout their entire time together. He'd read through the tale of the utterly gutsy shinobi several times over, oftentimes to calm his nerves or simply to reminisce, but he couldn't bring himself to do the same with the other one. Fukasaku had given it to him during his time on Mount Maboku when he was training to become a sage himself. As the elder explained it, he was instructed by Jiraiya himself to give him the book upon his death and when the toad deemed him ready. With how fast everything seemed to happen following Nagato's invasion, and due to his own reluctance, he'd never gotten around to even opening it. Beginning with a few cautious sips to ease his nerves and mind that morning as he reread the well-worn book for much the same reason, he took to drinking more and more, realizing, for the first time, how much of the story mirrored what little Jiraiya revealed about his own life. He could never before understand why he and Tsunade chose to drink so frequently, but the further along in the bottle he progressed, the more he was beginning to. Along with the warmth and the slight swing of his surroundings, he was beginning to feel numb to it all. The whispers of doubt and self-loathing quieted within his mind, leaving him feeling relieved, happy almost. He even found himself actually laughing at some of the more humorous sections of the book, but just as quickly, he returned to feeling disconsolate, knowing he would never again get to see or speak with his sensei. He snapped the book shut near the halfway point and placed it back within the seal on his arm, wiping at his eyes as he tried to stand, only to nearly stumble into the fire warming his tent. It was time for him to go. He extinguished the flame by urinating on it before trudging out of his tent just in time to see the bald boy flying in the sky with the aid of a glider, much to the delight of the tribe's young. They clapped and cheered as he swooped down over them, much to the ire of Sokka, who was shouting at him over having interrupted their training, but the boy either didn't hear him or he simply didn't care. Naruto decided to use their momentary distraction to leave undetected, taking another sip of the foul-tasting liquid, which was beginning to go down smoother with every swig. In his inebriation, he failed to notice Katara until he was suddenly face to face with her, but unlike before, she didn't appear angry with him. In actuality, she appeared reserved, shy almost, standing before him with her hands behind her back. "Hey," she muttered. "Hey," Naruto repeated, wiping his mouth, feeling unsure and unable to think clearly. "Look, I wanted to apologize for the way I was acting earlier," Katara continued, pushing a strand of hair from her face, looking down and away from him. "It wasn't right and, well, I'm sorry." It didn't quite become so apparent to Naruto how lost he was in the drink until he found himself thinking about just how beautiful she looked before him. So beautiful and stricken with befuddlement, he couldn't begin to formulate a response. He wondered then if perhaps the bottle was the reason Jiraiya often found himself in trouble with women. "You don't have to say anything," Katara looked to him again. The direction of the sun in the sky above made her eyes glow brightly, allowing him to see the intricacies within them. "About anything. I promise I won't bother you anymore. Just know that, whenever you're ready, or even if you never are, and, I don't know, you just want to talk about how cold it is, I'll be here to listen." Naruto continued to stare at her, dumbfounded, unsure of where the sudden change had come from, or exactly how he was supposed to respond to it. He'd done so long enough for her to come to a conclusion all her own, becoming crestfallen again. "I'll leave you to it, then. I'm going to go make sure my brother doesn't do anything dumb, well, no more so than usual," Katara finished with a chuckle of uncertainty. He watched her go. "Naruto." Katara turned back to him, confused. "Naruto," he repeated, palming his chest. "That is my name." "Naruto." Katara tried his name a few times, her smile increasing when she finally said it without sounding too stilted. "Naruto." Naruto nodded and, without realizing it, returned her smile very briefly before the true weight of his decision came crashing down around him, just as Sasuke did the same. Literally so. The bald boy's displays had gotten out of hand, leaving the boy buried deep in snow with only his feet exposed, kicking frantically. "Sasuke." Katara made it 2 steps before stopping to regard him. "I know I already told you, but, well, my name's Katara. We can talk more later, Naruto." She immediately seemed unsure of herself once more, as if regretful. "I mean, that is if you want to." "Yes," Naruto agreed, but he didn't mean it. He was a coward. She smiled at him before running off to help her brother. All around the tribespeople gathered, watching as Katara pulled at her brother's feet, all sharing in a laugh, but not out of malice. The girl herself soon began to giggle in her own failed attempts at freeing him. Working in unity, Sokka was freed, and even he could not remain angry for too long, joining in on the merriment. Mothers with their children, brothers and sisters. Regardless of direct relation, they were one big family, able to find joy even in the most mundane of moments. Together, the woes of the world meant little to them. Stricken with a sudden and sickening feeling of envy, Naruto frowned, taking to downing another considerable amount of the sake until his gag reflex would no longer allow him to before disappearing out of sight in a shunshin. He reappeared a distance away, stumbling and then falling, having implemented the technique rather sloppily. He picked himself up and began walking in the direction he'd taken to on nothing more than a whim. The search for a canoe was no longer on his mind, nor was anything but his regrets and failures louder than ever before. He swayed as he waded through the thick snow, falling a few more times, paying little mind to the fact he was consumed by his own negativity, until he found himself teetering on the edge of total and true despair. By the time he finished the bottle, he'd fallen again, but this time he didn't get back up simply because he was no longer able to do so. Everything was spinning and it was incredibly difficult to control his own movements. Having immediately forgotten he was out of sake, he tried to go in for another drink and found the bottle empty, making him feel irrationally angry. But just like with the alcohol, he'd exhausted any remaining rationale, losing himself fully in his emotions. Naruto crushed the bottle in his hand and did not let up, gripping the shattered remains as tightly as possible, listening to the glass crumble and watching how his bright red blood stained the snow. Now that he was no longer in control of his own thoughts, he could no longer fool himself into believing he'd ever return back to Konoha. He would never see his friends again. It would be delusional to think otherwise. After all, he could very well spend the rest of his days wandering the foreign world and it wouldn't matter. Everything and everyone he'd ever known and loved was forever lost to him. The only hopes he would ever have of seeing them again would be upon his own death. Naruto's tumultuous thoughts wandered to what would await him in the afterlife. But then he remembered he no longer believed in one. Not after everything that had happened, the atrocities he'd witnessed firsthand during the war forever seared into his memories. No rightful higher power would ever allow for so many innocent souls to be taken on the whims of monsters. There would be no afterlife waiting for him, as such, he would never again return to the life he knew or be reunited with those he lost. The best he could hope for was to find peace. But he didn't believe that would be possible either. He managed to sit up, using the blood from his hand to smear it along the seals on his arm sloppily, none of which required blood to utilize, unsealing much of his inventory. He reached for a larger scroll amongst many, painting it red as he unfurled it. It was the same scroll containing his map, some rations, and the 3 kunai. He studied the map with bleary eyes, looking at his home one more time before tearing it apart clumsily, his rage becoming audible in a series of animalistic roars. His movements continued to be loose and uncoordinated, and his head was almost too heavy to keep in place. To any outside observer, his actions were like that of a petulant child, crying and flailing in a tantrum. But to Naruto, it was the only way he could express everything he could no longer suppress. He fell forward again, watching as the final pieces of his world was carried away in the wind, further out of his reach, before finally becoming lost in the seemingly endless expanse of white. The kunai glinted and contrasted in the snow as he tried to reach for them. Just as they were within his grasp, he blacked out. When his senses finally returned to him, the sun was further along in the sky, and he found half of his face was numb from laying in the snow and a pool of his own vomit. Feeling even more intoxicated than before, and even more angry yet, he screamed again, and continued doing so until even the alcohol couldn't numb the pain in his throat, and his voice was nothing but a whisper. He looked to the kunai again, this time noticing the book Jiraiya had given him, buried halfway in the snow just beyond them. The one he never had the courage to open. Now, be it courage or a severe lack thereof in what was to be his final moments, he reached for it. He opened the book, but found he could not read further than the first page. The Naruto, the loud-mouthed brat I've come to see as my own son. I never had the chance to have any brats of my own, but because of you and your father, in a way, I feel like I have too. I consider myself pretty damn lucky to have met you both, and if I don't say it enough, just know I'm incredibly proud of you. I only ask you forgive this old man for not having been there for you sooner, but now that I am, I can't wait to see what kind of trouble we get into. I also hope that when you're reading this, I'm still around to have seen you become Hokage, but if I'm not, I'm sorry. I made this book so that, in a way, I'll always be with you. Hopefully I'm still around to show you these things myself, but if not, pay attention, kid. It's only my life's work. Well, our life's work, but you'll see what I mean. Take care of Tsunade, the village, and yourself, Naruto. Your old man. Jiraiya, the super pervert. Naruto felt hot tears running down his face, contrasted starkly against the chill which permeated down to his soul. He rolled over onto his back, openly and severely sobbing as he hoped and pleaded for a sign he shouldn't do what he was still set on doing, but he really wasn't expecting one, and he was in severe pain. A soul-consuming pain and a crushing despair unlike any he'd ever experienced before. One he knew would persist and follow him unless he put an end to it. Please, Naruto urged in between sobs, his words severely slurred. Mom, Dad, Jiraiya, anyone. Please tell me it's gonna be okay. Please tell me I don't have to do this. The wind howled eerily in the otherwise silence. That was his answer. His only answer. His justification. A reminder of the truth. And the truth was, he was alone. Naruto blindly reached around the snow until he found it. The steel of the kunai felt colder than even the snow and heavier in his hand than ever before as he directed it to just above his heart. Something his real best friend couldn't heal even if he was still present. Something nothing and nobody could ever heal again. He began applying pressure, feeling the new blade tear through his heavy coat with ease and then into his skin. It hurt but he persisted through it, finding the pain in his heart to be much worse, much more unbearable. Please, Naruto cried one final time, clenching his eyes shut. And just like before, he received no answer. With trembling, numb fingers, he steadied the kunai with his left hand while raising his right one, clenched in a fist, ready to bring it down on the handle. I'm sorry, everyone. He brought his fist down hard, splattering the snow around him just as a trailing red light shone brightly overhead. So this part ends here. Alright, that's it for today's video guys. Let me know in the comments section how was the story, and also don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I will meet you in another video. Bye bye.